Screen is on, mic is on. We're good to go. I like the little round of applause for like, yay, she can use basic technology. Yeah. Talk about adulting really well in the moment. As you just heard, Brian took us through some high points and some excitement that we'll be hitting on today. There are a lot of really, really wonderful speakers to hear, and we're going to be wrestling with some topics. And I think as more and more of us have realized, we can no longer leave our politics behind. We cannot divorce the personal from the political, because so much of what we do is personal, and so much of what we do is about fitting our own personal experiences into the empathy that we try to bring into our work, because we say that it is so core to our work, understanding and in some way relating to, and that's really the core of empathy, the experiences of people that are different from us. So we try to tap into that empathy. If we can't find empathy, we at least try to find sympathy. And I think before we get there, I need to take us down kind of a pretty dark path to understand where we are now. And then together we'll move out of it. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. In 1961, The Twilight Zone aired an episode called The Mirror. In it, Ramos Clemente was a revolutionary in Central America, and he was attempting with his friends to overthrow a cruel dictator. And they were working together, and finally they were successful, and there was a scene where he confronted this dictator right before he was able to get him out of power. And he said, fine, if you're going to assume power, if you're going to assume control of this country, so be it. Know, though, that you'll also be assuming the ownership and the responsibility for this ornate magic mirror that I have long trusted. And Clemente kind of scoffed at him, because even on The Twilight Zone, this seemed kind of wackadoo. And he said, no, pay attention. This ornate magic mirror, it's always appeared to show the innermost thoughts of my enemies. It always showed them to me before they could act, and I could always trust this mirror. And again, Clemente just scoffed at him and said, fine, whatever, go. It was a little bit more vicious than just a go. But he assumed power, and soon, new boss was same as the old boss. He was using the same sort of repressive techniques and tactics as the old leader had used, as his predecessor had used. And in his rise to power, he was starting to kind of push away some of the friends with whom he had assumed control. And he started seeing things in this magic mirror. He started seeing that the friends with whom he had assumed control were all individually and together plotting to take control from him. Sometimes they were plotting to kill him. And he grew really, really concerned. He was really frustrated by what he was seeing, so he had them all rounded up. He questioned them one by one. And even though they denied doing anything, they said they weren't plotting, they weren't going to overthrow him, they actually liked his repressive tactics. He had some fans there. He still had them each killed, until finally he was alone. And he was still incredibly frustrated. Turns out killing off all your friends doesn't do a lot for your psyche. But he was still really frustrated, and eventually walked in front of that mirror one day, and in a fit of anger, picked up his pistol, hurled it at it, broke into 1,000 pieces. And as this happened, by the power of coincidence, a priest happened to be walking past his door, and he heard the commotion from the inside, and he heard a gunshot. So the priest barreled forth, pushed open the door, knocked it down, and he walked in to see there was Clemente lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood, the gun still in his hand. And what do we take from this? Well, it's that Clemente saw what he wanted to see. And 50 years later, we're still using that same mirror. We see what we want to see. And when we frame the facts to fit our feelings, we have to understand, we have to empathize with our users, because they're doing that same thing. And any reality that they experience reflects more their innermost feelings more than any sort of external data that we could attempt to push on them. So maybe, yeah, they see what they want to see. But the bigger and growing issue is that our users are starting to look at a really distorted reflection in the mirrors with which they surround themselves. And we have our mirrors in the media with the brands that we think reflect our innermost values. And that reflection is becoming distorted. It's sort of a funhouse mirror now, but it's not really so fun, because we used to place trust in that reflection. We used to place trust in people and brands and organizations and maybe a government bigger than us, that was the best of us. A lot of our buying and shopping and voting is aspirational. And we should be able to have that kind of maybe youthful naivete. But either way, what we're seeing back now reflects something very, very different. There are inconsistencies in the mirror, and those inconsistencies are really jarring. Now, in the last election cycle, politicians of all stripes played fast and loose with the truth. I said this was going to get worse before it gets better, so we're going to start with Rudy Giuliani. He conveniently forgot September 11th. And this is a guy that Joe Biden used to say, somewhat in jest, that Rudy Giuliani can construct any sentence with simply a noun, a verb, and 9/11. Rudy Giuliani does not forget September 11th. But we also saw outright lies. And in previous elections, we would see these inconsistencies and castigate them as flip-flopping. Why? Because we like consistency. Humans prize consistency as much as we prize novelty, but we like how consistency makes us feel. But we saw gross inconsistency last time around. We saw Trump, who was an early proponent of the Iraqi invasion, suddenly kind of change his tune. But early on, he said it was great for the market, it was great for business, it was great for public sentiment. He really liked this thing. And then he started writing this revisionist history. So did the flip-flopping matter? No, it did not matter. It didn't matter to people that had already formed their opinions, because if they saw themselves as Trump supporters, they still liked the guy. They probably still like the guy. If people saw themselves not as Trump supporters, again, it didn't change their opinion that suddenly he was saying I was wrong, because he didn't exactly phrase it like that. We'd already formed our opinions because we already knew how we saw ourselves. So inconsistency may not hurt our loyalty, but it does undermine our critical thinking skills. And that's really important, because when Kellyanne Conway or some other spokesperson gets on TV and is feeding us fodder, not facts, we fill up on these contradictory statements, and they don't hold up to our own observation skills. So if we indulge in that kind of fodder, it's part of a poor information diet. And I am the last person to disparage choosing Twizzlers over tangerines in a real diet. But you know, too much garbage makes you feel weak, whether you're putting it in your mouth or in your ears. Not that you should be putting Twizzlers in your ears, but you do you. Maybe that is IA for good. So a lot of people say now that we live in this post-fact era. I don't dispute that. I dispute that we ever lived in a fact era, because having politicians lie and dissemble is nothing new. We've almost come to expect it. But we also expected that our heroes in the media would always take them down, whether it was the president, whether it was Gary Hart, whether it was former governor and Appalachian Trail enthusiast Mark Sanford. The media always held them to account. But newer forces in the media have been also wreaking havoc. Newer forces in the media are destabilizing our trust. When right-wing media is coaching us to question facts and replace outside expertise with just our internal instincts, we're replacing facts with what feels right. That's not good. And then with more and more access to data that we have now, we're losing access to good, reliable, comprehensive analysis. And we start to question institutions like the medical establishment, which means more and more people question the safety of vaccines, or they're questioning global warming, as we saw in the last video. And they're questioning other topics that are largely topics of consensus in the global scientific community, that community of experts that we used to trust. Now, the right-wing media and other sources, they're not alone in this, but they're practicing a journalism of affirmation. And that idea of simply telling it like it is might feel good. You know, they offer us this idea of false comfort, of hearing people that echo what we're already thinking. But it's dangerous, because in it, we're losing our ability to simply observe information and understand it for ourselves. Our ability to evaluate what we observe and internalize it is changing. And when we lose the ability to trust what we can see and trust what we can learn firsthand, there's a term for that. That's gaslighting. So back to the journalism of affirmation. I think it's important that we understand this. This is a term that Bill Kovach, the former Washington bureau chief of the New York Times and founder of Committee of the Concerned Journalists, he and Tom Rosenstiel, founder of the Project for Excellence in Journalism that's now a part of the Pew Research Center, they developed this concept. And they critique journalism that simply masquerades as being unbiased and objective. Well, it's actually working to do two things simultaneously. It's both bolstering the mindset of its audience, what they already have, and then it insulates them from empirical fact. That is dangerous, and it's confusing, and it's disorienting, because it's journalism that attempts to separate its listener or its reader or any of us or any of our users from their own lived experiences. And instead, it offers them repeated opinions, more of the fodder, less of the facts, as comfort instead. Again, that's institutional gaslighting. And this is dangerous. It's dangerous if we're like everyone here in the room and maybe in the business of helping our users make better decisions, or persuading them, or educating them, or maybe even marketing to them. It's also dangerous if we take off our professional hats and go back into our everyday lives and we're average citizens that are simply figuring out how to vote or what to support or what to buy. Over the past 10 years in social media, we've abandoned our old arbiters of reality, the old Walter Cronkites of yore. And instead, there's been this push toward a homophily of associating with people just like us, hearing from what our friends say on Yelp and on TripAdvisor and plenty of other sites, hearing from people just like us because they echo our innermost feelings and values. And we saw, though, in the last election cycle, what happens when we just seek out media that already sounds just like us. Our filter bubbles are getting a little bit shaky. We're realizing that there are some issues with them. And as we learn more and more about campaigns of misinformation from Russia, they're only going to get shakier. So when we lose confidence in published information, what happens? If we're turning away from the experts, if we're turning away from our peers, now we start turning inward. And this is a sort of narcissistic approach to safekeeping. But as we turn inward, that's where we start to see the effects of this poor information diet. We don't know what objective journalism looks like anymore. And when shoddy journalism and false equivalencies kind of team up, they undermine our ability to analyze information. Well, I mean, when was the last time you were like, let me check in with my gut, and you're like, I don't know how I feel. Even if it's about a simple decision about like what to have for dinner, or maybe what your next vacation is going to be, if you can live up to that level of privilege. So as our analytical skills suffer, our ability to simply trust external sources of expertise also suffers. And that's because inconsistency, whether it's lies, outright deception, deceit, it undermines trust both in our outside sources of expertise as well as in ourselves, in our gut instincts. So our decision-making skills begin to diminish. And that's the thing about inconsistency. You might think of it when you hear about a politician kind of playing with revisionist history, or you hear about a brand that's maybe trying to reorient itself around new values that you're like, wait, they don't have anything to do with how that company used to be and used to behave. And those choices might not change how you vote or where you shop, but they still affect you. Those choices, those issues, those inconsistencies still affect all of us. And that's because inconsistency, as it turns out, isn't an external metric, it's an internal tool. It's a tool that we use to evaluate new information, not against the old, but against how we already feel. So we look for inconsistency and we look for consistency with our own perceptions. And that's because we want to feel good about our choices and our decisions. We want to have choices that make us feel bolstered and comfortable in how we see ourselves. So if we see ourselves, if you see yourself as smart, as savvy, as worldly, as cultured, maybe as an environmentalist, or maybe as a survivalist that doesn't need all this society around us anyhow, whether you see yourself as healthy or somebody that's like, I see the tangerines, give me the Twizzlers, because this is who I am, that's fine. But you want to be able to make choices that align with those internal viewpoints. Now, when we evaluate our choices, we see what we want to see, and then we measure accuracy and relevancy against how we already think. So as we take in new information, we need to go through these cycles of deliberation and validation. And this is something that I've spoken about extensively in both content strategy and information architecture events and conferences and all. And that's because I think there's a lot of value in when we design for experiences that can benefit from being slow, when we design user experiences to slow down by maybe incorporating content types or sentence structures or making choices to favor paragraphs over bullet points that help people be more in the moment. Those things can be good because they enable us to tap into our gut instincts and say, is this really what I want? Do I feel comfortable with maybe this big ticket purchase or this big decision before I move forward with it? Those types of user experiences are not right for every brand. They're not right for every choice or every context, and that's fine. If something is a simple transactional decision, we don't need to put speed bumps in front of our users. But sometimes they need more time, and we need to design more time for them. But the problem is that this is not always good, because when we continue to only consume information that supports our existing viewpoints, well, we're only allowing in information that fits with our existing viewpoints. So your audience is ignoring any kind of new data that you might push or attempt to foist upon them if it doesn't fit with their existing mental models. And if this looks like some kind of incestuous, self-validating cycle, yeah, it is. And it's worse than an echo chamber. This is that kind of proverbial Ouroboros that is eating its own tail. And that's where we are now. So as we go through this kind of vicious cycle, soon what feels right trumps what is right, in here at least, and in the conversations that we have with others. And this looks an awful lot like confirmation bias, but it's different, and it's important that we understand the differences. This is cultural predisposition. As Jamel Bowie talks about it, your user narrows their ability to take in new information by how they build their identities and how they see themselves. And that's important because identities shape what we believe, what we let in, and what we don't let in, and what we push out. So how we form our beliefs, our cultural predisposition, that matters more than what we believe. And that's an important difference because how we see ourselves, again, maybe as outdoorsy, as caring parents, as urbanites, as people that are very worldly, as Muslims, as Jews, as feminists, as artists, as engineers, whatever that mindset is, it affects what you let in. It limits what you let in. I think it was James Baldwin that said, if we can describe it, we can control it. So it's good if we can describe this problem because that's also the business that many of us are in. Many of us work with taxonomy and labeling. So I think there is hope, and I think that hope can start here. Here's an example. If you're working with someone, maybe if you are someone, if I'm someone that is, say, skeptical of big pharma, and I put the unique health needs of my family before any kind of new government policy or crazy memes that I'm seeing float around and whatnot, maybe I don't care so much about what the rest of the group is doing. I'm not going to trust the latest information on vaccination guidelines that come out from the CDC. But recent studies show that there is hope and that we can design for hope to shift those beliefs, to move the needle on vaccinations, as it were, no pun intended. And that's not by offering a delusion. Thank you so much for laughing at that. I thought it was funny. It was hilarious in my head. The hope to fix that is not by just repeating the same deluge of hard science and pushing people back and saying, read this study, read this study, read that study. And there also isn't hope in simply passing around one more meme castigating people that push back against vaccine schedules. The hope is in arming existing healthcare professionals with information so that they can have personal one-on-one conversations with their patients, so that when their patients go in to see the pediatrician, they're hearing not the first time about vaccinations, but they're getting the same information repeated in a friendly way. And actually, and this is kind of the danger of this sort of subject matter, just last night, it's like the zeitgeist keeps on coming. Just last night, I saw a new study that's in the March issue of the journal Vaccine that talks about if we want to help people that are otherwise pushing back on the idea of vaccines, that consider themselves vaccine skeptics, we need to get information into the hands of people they already trust. So holistic health practitioners, that's who should be delivering this kind of content. So when we think about arming the right people with the right information to deliver at the right time, that's a core part of information design, information architecture, and content strategy. If we can meet a reluctant audience on their terms with how they see themselves with good information, then maybe we can shift their behavior and help all of public health as a result. So yeah, we are in a really difficult place right now as designers. But I think we can also be in a really hopeful place with the kinds of changes that we can make in our own work. Because if people are looking inward for answers, that's where we need to meet them. And I don't want to use this idea of empowering people as a Trojan horse for anything else. This is not an opportunity to simply create more content because it can serve as great clickbait. This is not an opportunity to market to people, to sell to them, to persuade them in any other way. This is simply an opportunity to make our users, to make our readers and our audiences more confident in the information they're getting themselves, to make them more confident and a little bit smarter. Because if your audience is looking in, let's help them be more able to help themselves. So when we ask how IA can be a force for good, I think we need to stop and first ask, well, what does it mean to be good? Is it about simplifying things? Is it about being more helpful? Is it about being nicer, bringing more delight into experiences, being kinder? I don't think it's any of those things. The most good that we can do is to empower people to be better able to do good themselves. When we make choices, when our design decisions remove barriers and replace them then with information so that people can feel stronger and more confident in their own decisions, we can amplify the efforts of other people. We can remove those barriers and make their work that much more successful because our design choices can make them smarter and more confident and more courageous and then more trusting in themselves. We can help them rebuild that effective gut instinct. We can help make them more trusting in themselves and then in others as well. And that's how we rebuild confidence and rebuild effectively a broken society. And I just want to take this as an opportunity to shout out to one of my favorite authors, Ray Bradbury. In Fahrenheit 451, he wrote, "Don't look to be saved in any one thing, person, machine, or library. Instead, do your own bit of saving. And if you drown, at least die knowing you are heading toward shore." So as people turn from experts, turn from peers, and turn inward to themselves, they're doing that. They're trying to head toward shore themselves. The most effective brands and organizations are there to meet them. And I think our work, as they're doing that kind of paddling to shore, we can help them swim. And there are three things that we can focus on as we do this. First is voice. As I said earlier, humans prize novelty. We love when we find a unique voice, whether it's in a 404 message or just a unique way of looking at things, maybe a different perspective. And those are the 404 pages as well as the long-form articles and really good bits of information design and charts and graphs that we love sharing, somewhat paradoxically. We like finding the new shiny thing and then passing it around so everyone else can see it too. So if we look at an example from Real Clear Politics, in their About page, they talk about the value and the investment that they make in what they call shoe leather reporting. They're out there doing the hard work, not simply curating what other people have said or passing through the same sort of hackneyed topic du jour yet again. Instead, they're investing in original content, which is not cheap, it is not easy, and it is not fast. But it's the kind of effort that underscores their credibility and makes them that much more valuable to their audience. It also helps attract new eyes, new audiences to their site and to their work. And if you think about it, it's that novelty that really helps get them a seat at the table. It's what gets your audience to pay attention in the first place. In addition to conducting their own reporting, they're also creating new perspectives by analyzing the outside research of others. So again, this goes back to that idea that we've got more and more data. We've got at our hands more and more data than ever before, but we don't always have good perspective on that data. We don't know always how to analyze it. But that's why people continue to seek out the wisdom of some of the brands that they like and trust and read the most. If your audience is hunting for content, it probably isn't that they just need to see the same data and stats yet again. It's probably because they want your perspective, and they want to get recommendations on how to act on that data. I want to move on now to talk more about volume, more about should we have more. And when we talk about the volume of content, oftentimes it is about creating more content. That is not always right. And I think sometimes we need to talk more about, are we offering our audiences the appropriate amount of content to support their decisions? But first, let's start with offering them more content. So let's look at volume. Here we have America's Test Kitchen, located locally. Shout out to Boston. They earn the attention, love, and loyalty of a really, really enormous audience because they empower their audiences to start wherever they are. So if you're a novice cook, they're going to offer you lots of little tips and points to remember as you're moving through a recipe so that you can get that additional reading, additional insight to help build your own success in the kitchen. And if you're an advanced chef, you can find information to support your needs and your interests as well. Maybe it's additional recipes that take on a similar technique or additional recommendations to incorporate the next time you're trying an old recipe. And in their publishing platform, they produce an extensive amount of content. There are cooking shows. There's an online cooking school to which you can subscribe. There are multiple magazines. There's Cooks Illustrated, Cooks Country. There are lots of different cookbooks. There's the TV show. They rework old recipes in the form of what works now in 2018 when we don't all just have a block of lard in the freezer. They offer a lot on their publishing platform. And I say that as somebody that does not cook. I'm really adept at the 30-second button on my microwave and in opening packages of Twizzlers and saying dinner is served. But I say that as someone that can appreciate good content. And I appreciate when this type of content feeds me at night. But I say that as someone that can appreciate good content because they offer an enormous variety of content types because across this publishing platform, the content is always tailored for the different platforms, the different channels, as well as the different use cases that their audience might encounter. So for example, if you're in the kitchen holding your phone, looking at a recipe, you're going to be able to just see it depicted in a series of photos. And as you're swiping through those photos, you don't have to scroll back up to see the steps in that recipe. Instead, each step is captured in the caption for each photo. If you're looking at that same recipe, though, say in the magazine that month or on their website, there you're going to find paragraph after paragraph doing what Cooks Illustrated does best, living up to that geeky, wonderful, scientific reputation of saying, we tried 50 different ways to make the best batch of chocolate chip cookies, and we tried it in this pan and with this oven setting, da-da-da-da-da. Here's the best way. Secret, it's in browning the butter. So when you're going through that process, again, whether you're a novice cook or a more experienced chef, they're setting you up for success. You can tap into their wisdom so that you can build your own wisdom. And they're also teaching you to build your own gut instincts. I had the opportunity to sit down with Jack Bishop, the Chief Creative Officer there. And he shared that so much of what they do is about not telling people, bake it for 30 minutes, but rather bake it until it looks like this, smells like this, maybe springs back in this way, which is probably about 30 minutes, and that's because everyone's oven is different. He also commented that when people say they don't cook, they usually say it's because I don't have time to. And he believes it's not quite about that. It's usually because they haven't yet experienced success. When we're good at something, we want to keep doing it. We want to repeat it. Because success builds confidence. Success breeds confidence. And that's what they're trying to do there because they're selling empowerment, not just the perspective of a single chef. This is not a cult of personality. Instead, they've designed their entire organization to support this idea of building confidence. All of their recipes are tested out by the team in the kitchen. It's usually, I think, about half a dozen people, as well as then maybe 50 or 100 home chefs to whom they send out that recipe to test as well. They're constantly going back and forth on it, working to get it right. And that's because when they're successful, when they've created that more foolproof recipe, they know their audience can be successful well, and in that way feel stronger and more confident in their choices and their actions. If we look at electronics retailer Crutchfield, You can see something similar going on here as well. With America's Test Kitchen, I had that long kind of zoomed out version of how long a recipe is. If you look there on the left, you'll see also, if you zoom out on a listing on Crutchfield's site, maybe you're looking for a piece of home audio equipment or a new car stereo or a new camera lens. If you look at that from a distance, you'll find a page that goes on and on and on and on telling you about that camera lens, what it looks like to hold it in your hand, what it feels like, the kind of images you can produce with it, how much you can zoom in. You can see diagrams about it. You can read what other people have written about it. They offer really long pages, and their analytics prove out when their audience gets to the end of those pages, they're typically saying, tell me more, I want more content, I need more information to feel more confident in my choices. So for them, education really drives empowerment, and empowerment drives confidence, and confidence drives trust, which we usually call that customer loyalty. But they talk about that they want everyone to have enough information to feel good about their decisions from the time they are putting a product in the shopping cart till it arrives at their house. Because when people feel good, then they're going to want to buy the product, and then they'll be happy with the product. They're not going to be incurring return shipping charges. So they say it's important for their customers to be the decision makers. They're empowering their customers with that responsibility. Their chief content officer, Amy Leonard, also speaks about what goes on with a different sort of content type when you call their customer service team. So you're calling into the call center or engaging on live chat. Again, that's a designed experience. And the way they kind of shape their team and encourage their team to engage with their audience is by being careful and listening and asking lots of questions. They want to have that conversation because sometimes someone's calling in and saying, you know, I'm considering this stereo. These are my goals. I'm looking for something that I can have out in the garage while I'm working on the car. So there's a lot of hard surfaces, concrete floor. Is this going to like echo really weirdly in here? And sometimes you might call in saying, you know, I'm looking at this $100 stereo, and they say, you might be good with just this $20 version. Sometimes they're telling their customers that. If you look at a lot of the feedback on their site and comments from their customers, those are the kinds of comments. It's people saying, I ended up walking away with a product that was much less expensive than what I was initially considering. Or, you know what, I decided I'm not ready to buy, but I feel so much better about what I learned. And those kinds of responses are indicative of a much smarter audience that is learning and learning to test and check in with their own gut instincts as they get smarter and wiser about the experience, because what they're doing is effectively building confidence. So if we remember this kind of vicious cycle, remember, our audiences are going through it anyway. And if they're going through it, let's figure out how to fit information in to meet them where they already are. Because if you're not talking with them about their home audio options, who is? And if you're not talking with them about how to register to vote, who is? That's something that gov.uk had to go through because they realized when people in the UK were looking for information about basic government services, a few years ago, they could go to 9 different government websites, and oftentimes, not surprising, reading very contradictory information across those different websites. In fact, people got to the point where rather than turning to the government for information about government services, more often than not, they were looking to The Guardian, the newspaper, instead to see information about how to register to vote or how to pay their taxes. So the government's approach to this wasn't to offer more content, but instead to engage in the process of information design, refinement, and editing to weed through their content, to first make the choice to only comment on the things that only government could have a perspective on. They also needed to bring in affordances to signal when content was complete and when it was canonical, so that people didn't feel like they needed to look across the entire myriad pages of the website. So by paring things down to the essentials, bringing in cues and visual affordances, like even a simple government seal denoting that this is official, they were able to weed down through their content and bring 75,000 pages of content down to 3,000 that were that much more actionable, effective, and empowering. Now this is, again, not cheap, not easy, and certainly not inexpensive. But editing things down, offering the appropriate level of information, whether it's a lot or very little, but the essential stuff, that's our job. This is about helping and empowering our users, not just ourselves. So finally, I want to close by looking at vulnerability. And this is a topic that is coming up more and more as we talk about empathy and the feel-good side of what we do. Sometimes the feel-good side is not always easy, but this is an opportunity for brands to open up, to say, here's our experience, but see what you think. Your mileage may vary. That's something that Volkswagen does. So if you're considering a new car purchase, you can go to their site and say, all right, here's what I'm considering. Here are the variables that I think are most important. Maybe it's fuel economy, maybe it's having a stick shift. And they'll say, all right, compare it with other car options from other brands. We'll bring that information here onto our site for you. And comparison allows that kind of consideration. They bring in tools that basically allow their users to do their own research there on Volkswagen.com. And you can put together different research reports for yourself. You can gather up the data yourself and basically conduct your own research. Be the scientist, be the expert, not just someone that is looking to others for expertise. Real Clear Politics does this by bringing in outside viewpoints and having them there on their site. And this is not anything new. This is fairly similar to what Newsweek was doing 30 years ago in bringing conservative commentator George Will in to write a column for their otherwise fairly liberal publication. It is not new, but it's something that we seem to grow a little bit fearful of, bringing in those outside voices and welcoming them, offering them a seat at our table. BuzzFeed does this by curating content at the bottom of many of their articles that comes from across the social web to see on the topics on which they're reporting, what are other people saying? Maybe on Reddit, and people have many things to say on Reddit, but what are they saying? What are they saying on Facebook? They're combing the web, bringing it back to their site. And that labor can sometimes look like revisiting your own old ideas. If we go back to America's Test Kitchen in the back of Cooks Illustrated every month, oftentimes they have a section where they say, yes, 10 years ago, this was the pressure cooker we recommended, or this was the best way we said to brown your beef. Well, hey, now we've had opportunity to look back at our old recommendations and revisit them. Here's what we say now because maybe we were wrong. Maybe there's new information, and we can be mature enough to acknowledge that new information. So when brands embrace humility and vulnerability as a strategy, not just as some sort of false play and lip service, there's a real opportunity there because they help users better see themselves in the content and information and the experiences that they're presenting. Vulnerability is a necessary part of empathy. And if we want that to be more than just a buzzword, we need to acknowledge that and bring it into our own design practice. If we can empower our users, if we can educate them, we can help them to better understand what they see in our own sites, in our own designed experiences, and really in the world around them. If we can meet them where they are, we can help them help themselves. And I think that that is so vital because as long as they're looking to the media, as long as they're looking to brands that they like, let's offer them an accurate reflection. Let's give them an opportunity to see themselves in us because that's the only way they'll be able to regain trust in the mirrors that we offer to begin with. Thank you.